They underestimated you, believing you were simply another participant in their game. Someone who would stick to the script, accept the bare minimum, and remain in line. However, they forgot who they were dealing with. You were not created to be governed, persuaded by approbation, or to beg for a place at any table. You're the exception, the force. They never prepared for the time you established your limits. The equilibrium changed at first. They rejected it. I was certain that the stillness would not continue long, that you would eventually crawl back. But then nothing. There will be no begging, justifications, or frantic efforts to hang on to something that was unworthy of you. And that's when the terror struck, because they recognized the truth. They were not the ones who kept you in their world. You were the one who let them into your home. They ridiculed you. Now, whisper your name. Those who questioned you now reflect your power. They pledged they would not alter. But now they find themselves following in your footsteps, and they won't confess it. However, the presence they once rejected is now impossible to avoid. You were never simply another individual passing through. You were the wake-up call, the transition they were not prepared for. And now they must confront the inescapable reality. They lost access to something invaluable. The light beams in the dark, and the darkness has not overwhelmed it. John 1 verse 5. At first, they ignored you. They convinced themselves that you were nothing more than a passing figure, an afterthought, someone who could be ignored without consequence. They were certain that your presence was routine. Your influence is just brief. They convinced themselves that you were replaceable, that how you conducted yourself didn't important, and that your standards were just superfluous regulations designed to make life more difficult. However, light cannot be ignored. No matter how much darkness surrounds it, it continues to shine. Over time, they began to feel it. The silent change, the inescapable pull, the knowledge that they couldn't escape the same people who had ridiculed you, rolled their eyes at your discipline, and scoffed at your expectations. Now, live your life differently. They carry themselves more cautiously, treading more carefully where they earlier stepped carelessly. Their words have softened. Their options have narrowed. They do not comprehend why, but something inside them has moved. And if they were honest, they'd understand why. It wasn't adoration that influenced them. It was a need. Life humbled them in ways they didn't foresee. They had previously loved recklessness, but it was now driving them in circles. The impulsiveness that previously seemed like freedom became the very thing, locking them in an unbreakable circle. And as the walls closed in, when their own patterns caught up to them, they began to recall you. They first attempted to reject it, telling themselves they weren't following your example, and that their newfound insight had nothing to do with the exact ideals they had insulted. Time does not lie. The past catches up, and one by one, they began to do things they had sworn they would never do. The person who sneered at your discipline now takes pleasure in their self-control. The person who once criticized your work ethic now swears by structure. The person who believed you were too much now requires the same amount of respect you once needed. They do not speak about it. They will not tell you. Their pride will not permit it. However, their acts betray them. They move differently now, whether they confess it or not. You're the reason why. At first, they disregarded the soreness as a transient experience. They assured themselves they'd outgrown the past and that nothing was lacking. But no matter how deeply they buried the notion, it refused to be silenced. The framework they had fought against, the exact order they intended to overthrow, was the only thing protecting their society from collapsing into chaos. They look for alternatives, clutching at empty imitations, but nothing truly fits. Faces change, conversations change, yet an unshakable void remains. They look for something familiar in unexpected settings, only to discover that the one constant, the power that brought order to the turmoil, has slipped out of reach. And now they're faced with an unnerving fact. The disappearance of something people previously took for granted is the most audible sound of all. There are no sophisticated machinations or meticulously designed retribution, simply distance. That was sufficient. By walking away, you gave the only genuinely meaningful outcome. They now observe from afar, putting together parts of your life via murmurs and glances. They hear your name when they can no longer say it. Watch as doors that they formerly strolled through without doubt shut. Their casual laughing now has a new meaning. The tables never had to be turned. They were always placed in your favor. The most significant change was not in what you accomplished, but in what you refused to do. There will be no more unlimited second chances or unrestricted access. The revelation didn't arrive in a single instant, but rather from the weight of being blocked off, and nothing disturbed them more than the basic fact. You did not need to battle for control. You simply removed it. Strength is admirable in principle, but it may be unsettling in practice. The majority do not desire equality. They want control. When they know you're beyond their control, discomfort sets in. They term it inflexibility, stubbornness, anything to hide their discomfort. You took their words to heart, assuming that accommodation equaled knowledge, that bending indicated equilibrium. But the more you provided, the more they wanted, until you felt yourself retreating into the gaps that they provided. Then one day, the pattern broke. A line was established that could not be crossed. No explanations, no excuses, only action. In that instant, the dynamic changed. The pain was no longer yours to bear. Those who formerly determined the parameters of your presence now stand before an impenetrable wall. For the first time, they comprehended. Power was never about controlling people. It was about never giving up control over oneself. The stone the builders rejected has now become the cornerstone. Psalm 118, verse 22. They rejected you as inconsequential, certain that you were simply another voice in the throng. But they failed to see that you were never intended to fit in. You were designed to stand out. And today, just as the foundation they once rejected has become the one they build on, the strength they scorned has become the one they now depend on. Something had changed by the time they emerged. Oh, they look the same, walk the same, and have the same name. But the essence had transformed. That wild pride they had carried about like a flag has evolved into something else. They now have discipline, control, and comprehension, which they previously lacked. And it occurred so delicately, so silently, that they didn't detect the inside alteration. They began to pronounce terms that they had before ridiculed. They made decisions they swore they would never make. And if you ask them why, they won't be able to answer you, since they don't remember where they first heard those words or who traveled that journey before them. But, you recall that long before they adopted these values, they opposed them not because they were incorrect, but because they were not ready to accept them. That is how truth works. It is not usually accepted at first. It is unsettling. It confronts and makes people uncomfortable. But truth does not need permission to take root. It does not need validation to hold power. All it needs is time and time. My buddy has completed his job. Now look at them. Those who rolled their eyes at your standards now live by them. Those who derided your discipline are now imposing it. The folks who regarded your limits as useless now have their own, with the same zeal you previously had. They don't know it, but the presence they sought to ignore has formed them. You never pushed someone to change. You never begged for their approval. You just held the line, refusing to lower the bar or divide yourself into smaller parts in order to make others feel comfortable. That, above all, is what transformed them. See, genuine influence is not loud. It does not ask for recognition. It does not require recognition. It's just like a tree planted near the river. It stands solid. The seasons shift. The storms arrive. The wind rages. But in the end, it persists. And those who previously mocked its might will ultimately find themselves standing in its shadow. That is what you are. You are evidence that the truth cannot be suppressed indefinitely. You are proof that true strength cannot be shaken. Others swayed back and forth, bending to meet the situation. You stood steadfast. And now, long after they have forgotten their own words, they are fashioned by yours. They felt they were rejecting you, but they were really rejecting something they were not ready to accept. And now that they've gone full circle, treading in the same footsteps they ridiculed before, they're starting to comprehend. You did not lose them. You guided them. And even after they've forgotten why they changed, they will continue to live by the ideas you have stood for all along. Acknowledgement is seldom expressed in words. There will be no confessions or statements of remorse. However, the evidence is obvious. They ignored your standards until they had to enforce their own. They laughed at your ideals. However, they now see them as their own gospel. The lack of your presence became the lesson they never expected. Control was never essential. You never had to demand respect because the instant you entered a room, the vibe changed in ways people couldn't ignore. The weight of your assurance spoke louder than any statement. People sensed it before they could express it. Authority isn't about quantity. It is about resonance. It lingers, altering perceptions. Long after you leave the room, some will reject this. Some may fight it, but none will escape. Even those who previously questioned your position are now mindless and follow the route you set. It was never about persuading them. It was about knowing oneself so thoroughly that they had no option but to acknowledge what they had previously neglected. The cycle is constantly repeated. Those who questioned, challenged, and attempted to undermine eventually return with an implicit understanding. Unquestionably, certainty has weight, one that bends the wills of individuals who were formerly opposed. They don't always recognize it, but their actions betray them. The assurance that had disturbed them now pulls them in. Leadership was never about controlling others. It was about unwavering presence. The strongest command is not issued. It's understood. No huge gestures or announcements. Just an unshakable sense of one's own worth. In such light, others must choose whether to rise to the occasion or fade away undetected. The decision is always theirs, but the conclusion is predetermined. Those who were formerly unsure now stand firm on what they have always known. Do you know that in a race, all the runners compete, but only one wins the prize? So run, and you may get it. 1 Corinthians 9:24. There are two types of individuals in the world: others that go the extra mile, and others who seek the simplest solution. Some will grind. Some will make sacrifices. Some are determined to overcome any difficulty. Others will wait for a shortcut, a handout, an easy path that never really gets anywhere. And when individuals who have spent their lives prioritizing comfort over discipline see someone who refuses to compromise, it shakes them. Because they understand you move differently. You are the one who refuses to settle. The one who does not sacrifice integrity for convenience. The one who does not distort the facts in order to make others feel better. And this shocks people. Because if what you stand for is genuine, every explanation they've ever offered is nothing more than a self-deception. So they refer to you as excessive. People think you take things too seriously. They ridicule your concentration, drive, and standards, not because they don't respect them, but because acknowledging that you are correct would imply admitting that they were wrong. But time has a way of putting things right. Those same voices who previously chastised you, they have gone silent. Those who ridiculed you for being inflexible now conduct themselves with the same rigor. Those who vowed they'd never follow your path have found themselves following in your footsteps. They won't say it out loud, but it's clear from the way they move in, the decisions they make, and how they approach issues. Because this is the truth. Greatness is undeniable. You never asked for recognition. You've never demanded respect. You just became, while others sought approval. You were the standard. That's why the frightened disliked you. Why did the weak avoid you? Why did the strong respect you? You did not endeavor to be a leader. Leadership followed you. You did not seek influence. Your presence drew attention. Those who couldn't bear it faded. See, some individuals seek achievement without the cost. They want the prize but reject the discipline. They like the concept of grandeur but loathe the effort required to achieve it. And when they met you, they saw what was possible and that their excuses were meaningless in the company of someone who refused to make them. They had two options: rise to the standard or fall behind. Some rose, some have vanished, but none of them stayed the same. That is the power of genuine influence. It does not beg. It does not pursue. It does not demand to be seen. It's just like a mountain standing up against the passage of time. Like fire, which refines all it touches. It alters everything around it. And whether they confess it or not, whether they thank you or claim they didn't notice, it doesn't matter since the truth stands. You did not just show them what was possible. You made them wonder why they ever tolerated anything less. Some people seek influence, but only when they control the reins. They understand they no longer have control. Admiration evolves into opposition. They push, prod, and look for cracks, certain they can bend what won't shatter. They expected acquiescence, but instead saw opposition. They believed they could manipulate, only to be faced by an unstoppable force. The power dynamic altered when they discovered they couldn't shape you. And that's when everything changed. There is always someone from the past who recalls this all too well. Someone who previously mistaken assurance for arrogance, who regarded resilience as a task. They tested. They had doubts. They pushed pressure, anticipating capitulation, only to discover they were the ones unraveling. Then came the inevitable. The one quality they intended to diminish became the one they couldn't get away from. Some people only appreciate strength when it remains steadfast before them, and then they encountered something that refused to bow, refused to seek permission, refused to shrink. They felt pulled to it, even if they won't acknowledge it. They criticized, they dismissed, they attempted to break you. But, in the end, you were not the one who changed. It was them. They weren't just pushing limits. They were looking for their own. Initially, they opposed everything. What you stood for. I dismissed your style of navigating around the world. They convinced themselves that your requirements were excessive. However, perceptions change throughout time. The same voices that formerly criticized you now support you in places where you are not present. They are not going to reveal their change of heart. Pride will not allow them. But pay attention to how they discreetly correct inaccuracies and how they no longer tolerate the contempt they formerly showed. They unknowingly defend your name. The struggle was never between you and them. It was just them and the truth. They were not prepared to face. The triumph was never meant to prove anything. It was about standing firm till they saw for themselves. You were never searching for approval or pushing others to comprehend. You just lived your own truth. Without understanding it, you molded theirs. Those who used to accept less than what they deserved now demand more. Those who formerly questioned your determination have learned to hold their stance. And, although they may never admit it, the transformation started the minute they observed. You refused to compromise. It was never just about limits. It was about self-respect. What exhausted you was their realization that you refused to entertain. They started to wonder why they had previously accepted less. You did not need to preach. You did not need to persuade anybody. All it required was becoming a live example of what it meant to walk with confidence. They used to think that refusing to compromise was arrogant. But now they realize what it was. Clarity. A person might spend years feeling they have no option but to persevere until one moment changes everything. A discussion and observation. An indisputable reality that affects their worldview. It occurs silently. I see Asian coming in like light through a crack in the wall. And once it's there, it can't be ignored. The shift is not just personal. It spreads. People around you start to see possibilities they hadn't considered before. It has an influence that lasts long after the words are said, forcing individuals to reconsider what they previously considered as normal without asking for it. Without realizing it, you set the example for others to follow when they feel it's time to demand more. No weapon made against you will flourish, and every mouth that rises against you in judgment, you will condemn. Isaiah 5,417. Some individuals in our world feel they can bend reality to their will. They believe that with the correct words, manipulation, and pressure, they can get anybody to dance to their song. They go about life like puppet masters, manipulating strings, directing results, and making others doubt themselves until they don't know what's true anymore. And at first, they were certain you'd be just like the others. They studied. You observed how you moved. They looked for weak areas to dig their hooks into. They were certain that with enough time, they could distort your words, create uncertainty in your thoughts, makes you doubt your own strength. They have done it before, innumerable times. They left a trail of folks who had no idea they were being fooled. But this time, something was different. They used the same methods, plans, and manipulation. But nothing worked. Every effort to shake you resulted in something unexpected. Resistance. They pressed, expecting you to break. You did not. They tested, expecting you to fold. You did not. They waited for you to buckle under strain, second-guess yourself, and seek their approval, just to relieve stress in the room. That time never arrived because, while they spent their lives perfecting the art of control, you had already perfected the skill of standing strong. And that was when everything changed. Frustration and doubt crept in. they realized for the first time that they were dealing with another person. They couldn't move. They couldn't blame, twist, or lie. They were not accustomed to the sensation of their strength slipping through their grasp. So they tried more, pushed harder, and dug deeper into their bag of tricks, hoping that with just a little more pressure, something, anything, would shatter. But when they pushed harder, they sensed something. They didn't foresee the weight of their own failure. Because the fact is that they were never in charge. They never had influence over you. They simply had illusions. And you refused to play their game by not reacting, explaining, or attempting to prove yourself. That was when the game finished. See, silence is its own kind of weapon. It's heavier than words, more powerful than arguments, and louder than any defense. And in that stillness, they had to confront something they had avoided their whole lives. You were never as foolish as they were. They wanted a response. You gave them none. They intended to shake you. You were unshaken. They want control. They lost it. They realized they'd never possessed it in the first place. And now they were watching from a distance. They pretend they don't care, acting as if they had moved on. But deep down, they realize they've encountered something they can't break. And it scared them. It wasn't just rejection. They believed it was exposure. They'd spent so much time creating illusions. They put so much work into persuading themselves. They were always in charge. However, confronting someone who was immune to their techniques constituted a reality check. And now all they can do is watch from the sidelines. They pretended not to notice. Pretend that they've moved on. Pretend they don't care. However, the reality persists in the way they constantly seem to be in the same places, in the way their actions contradict their words, and in the way they replicate what they previously disregarded. They don't just acknowledge your existence. They're influenced by it. They can't ignore what they've learned, no matter how hard they attempt to reject or avoid it. The actual exam was never yours to take. It was theirs, yet they failed. Some thrive on power, incorporating influence into every encounter and influencing results to their liking. They expect to be the dominant force in any room. Who decides who gets raised and who is left behind? However, when they confront something immovable, something they cannot mold, control, or outmaneuver, the basis of their authority starts to crumble. They fought ignoring, downplaying, and persuading themselves. But what they see before them is an illusion. However, denial has a limited duration. Reality eventually demands admission. And when they stare at you, steadfast, unshaken, resistant to the games they've learned, they understand they've found someone unique. They probe boundaries, push limits, look for weaknesses, and strive to validate that what they feel is true. Not because they dislike you, but because they need to realize they've spent their whole lives bending others. So when they come upon someone who refuses to submit, the balance flips from scorn to obsession and resistance to intrigue. And behind it all, a silent reverence that they will never express. They will not say it out, but their actions speak for themselves. The way they imitate your mannerisms, the subtle changes in their approach, and the way they compare themselves to your presence. You weren't intended to be the oddity. The world had always conformed to their expectations, but you did not. And it is what worries them the most. Others chose the easy road, nodding along, letting things slip, and perpetuating comfortable delusions. But you know the patterns, the self-sabotage, and the paradoxes. You did not enable, placate, or pretend everything was all right. You merely mirrored back what they did not like to see. And this is why they fought so hard against you. Not because you were incorrect, but because they suspected you were correct. They classified you as tough, dismissive, unforgiving. Anything to avoid recognizing that your presence compelled them to accept reality. Yet, as time passes, something changes. The same folks who formerly pushed back the hardest start walking differently. The ones who derided your discipline are now enforcing their own. Those who felt you were too strict now maintain the standards they previously condemned. They may never admit it or accept that you were the spark, but the evidence is in their development. And long after the clamor has subsided, when they are confronted with a moment of uncertainty, when they stand at a crossroads between complacency and progress, one idea will resound in their minds: the standard you established, the expectations you refused to lower. It was never about their recognizing your value. It was always about their ability to rise to the occasion.